Thank you very much. I don't have a PowerPoint slide, but if I didn't have a PowerPoint slide, then there would be the program here, which would be kind of distractive. So I sent in a black slide and added just my name just to own it. So this is my background. It will not change during the talk. Wow. I don't have slides because I just want to read this piece that I wrote. Yeah, the title, The Cracks of the Contemporary, is a project that I'm working on for the past few years, and it's building up slowly. This is a part of it. So, the cracks of the contemporary, the wound. 1. Every heart is broken. Near the end of his novel, Colorless, Tsukura Sasaki and His Years of Pilgrimage, Haruki Murakami concludes that the different forms of harmony that mark the life of Tsukuru are all accompanied by the wound. Then he turns this into the following conclusion. And this is a quote from Murakami then. One heart is not connected to another through harmony alone. They are instead linked deeply through their wounds. Pain linked to pain, fragility to fragility. There is no silence without a cry or grief, without a cry of grief. No forgiveness without bloodshed. No acceptance without a passage through acute loss. This is what lies at the root of true harmony. End of quote. So there are two very important claims that Murakami is making. I'm just going to take this off. There are two very important claims that Murakami is making in this quote. First, there is the posthuman claim. At least that's what I would call the posthuman claim. Wounds are not deficiencies. They are no minor failures of nature that happen to someone by accident. There's nothing personal about wounds. Consequently, the wound is never a part of me or of anyone or anything else. A wound is always somehow a shared wound, leading a singular existence in itself and realizing itself in different ways upon the surface that we live. I embody the wound, just as you do, and just as many others do. The wound is a crack that traverses many forms of life. Organic, non-organic, and organic. It cuts through the microbe as it cuts through a galaxy, as it cuts through an ice crystal, as through a pack of wolves. And yes, it cuts through you as it cuts through me, and we might find a way to ease each other's pain. The question is not whether wounds can heal. When Tsukuru claims that he wants to put things behind him, slowly closing up the wound and conquering the pain, this has nothing to do with healing, of course. The rest of the book confirms this. The wound will always be there. As Sarah puts it so nicely, and this is a quote again from the book, I understand, but maybe it only appears from the outside that the wound is closed. End of quote. Later, also Tsukura acknowledges this. Quote again. 16 years have gone by, but it feels like the wound is still there inside me, like it's still bleeding. Something happened recently, something very significant to me that made me realize this. End of quote. Wounds cannot heal. Life has taught us in many ways that sickness does not exclude health and vice versa. There are always 1,000 tiny sicknesses and 1,000 tiny healths at work at the same time. Wounds transform, mold into other wounds, merge into bigger ones or shred into pieces, but they will always matter. The questions I propose then instead are, how do we live the wound? How do we live the many wounds that crack the surfaces that we travel? How do we cope with the visible and invisible undercurrents that are exposed to us in our everyday lives? The second claim that Murakami makes concerns time. For as the wound does not happen to anyone, it also does not happen in time. Or to phrase it differently, the wound is never present. It does not take place. And it is always already here. As Eri confirms, near the end of the book, the wound happens, and I quote, in all the echoes that surround us, in the light, in shapes, in every single ... End of quote. In terms of time, being non-present would mean that the existence of the wound cannot take part in the economic, social, and political reality of the day. The wound will always find ways to withdraw from that, hidden under weak and fragile surfaces that will remain supersensitive and ready to crack again. The wound does not stop existing, as the crack never stops. It has always already grown into a life of itself, and it will search for other ways of cracking, other forms of existing. It's the harmonies and the resonances that make up the present, that affects the effects that connect and relate. But the wound immanently acts through its virtual impact on the present. Realizing a history and a future of the body, the wound happens with the times. And as such, it introduces the present to the contemporary, a concept with which I refer to the wide range of possible and impossible acts that mark our days. And can we conclude from this that both the past and the future take place upon the wound? The past and the future are two very different forms of time that are not in any way to be placed in a linear sequence with each other. They cannot be compared, and similar to sickness and health, they cannot exclude each other either. They happen together in the emptiness of the wound. In fact, they can only take place upon it. For it is only the emptiness of the wound which matters and offers us a chaosmosis of pasts and futures. The emptiness of the wound is the crisis upon which we meet. The wound lures us in. It lies deep inside of us, as it lies deep inside everything else, inviting us into the void, the black nothingness that contains everything and nothing. The economic, social, and political realities that make up the present envision us a surface upon which everything occurs, but it is rather inside what occurs that the event itself, or the purely expressed, as Gilles Deleuze calls it, happens. In search for the purely expressed, Deleuze goes on citing Joe Bousquet, who adds to this, is a quote from Bousquet, "Become the man of your misfortunes. Learn to embody their perfection and brilliance." End of quote. Sip of water. Part 2 is called 3 Wounds. In his introduction to psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, after Émile Dubois-Reymond, talks of the 3 narcissistic wounds that are not just deep inside us, but that, like all wounds, crack themselves into every possible directionality and dimensionality. 3 wounds that open up voids in the mental, social, and environmental ecologies that we live. All 3 of them continue to crack the so-called dualist myth, expressed, for instance, by Descartes and Kant. This stubborn fantasy of exceptionalism, which in every way aims to secure our special position, always comes down to the creation of difference, the turning of this difference into a hierarchy, and finally the organization and institutionalization of this hierarchy, putting ourselves on top. This myth is cracked 3 times. First, Freud notices the realization that our Earth was not at the center of the universe, which we ascribe to Copernicus. Secondly, he refers to the findings of biological research in his days, think of Darwin and Wallace, which show that man was never radically different from the other species in the animal kingdom. And finally, and rightfully so, Freud mentions his own research interests, noting that the importance of the unconscious to human thought puts a 3rd big question mark over the idea of the rational man. It is crucial to note here that Freud already stressed that these 3 ideas were no discoveries to be attributed to particular wise men in the history of Western thought. His interests were never in setting up epistemologies, philosophies of science, or history of thought. Freud, the psychoanalyst, is interested in cases. He is interested in how these thinkers live their wounds, what it means to live one's misfortunes, what it means to be worthy of one's times, to feel the misfortunes in which one finds oneself, and how this happens irrespective of time and space. Thus, Freud stresses that the ideas of Copernicus, for instance, could already be found in the Alexandrian doctrines. And similarly, Émile de Bois-Reymond, a Berlin-based theorist writing in the mid-19th century and a major influence on Freud, William James, and actually all the big names that come into psychoanalysis later on, has stressed how closely related these 3 wounds actually are. In an eulogy to Darwin, written in 1882, Du Bois-Reymond claims, "Darwin seems to me to be the Copernicus of the organic world," saying that they're actually doing the same thing. They're discovering the same thing. Consequently, Du Bois-Reymond critiques Descartes for not being worthy of the times in which he lived. Descartes knew about Giordano Bruno, who indeed lived his misfortunes. Bruno was famous for his thoughts about pantheism and his rejection of any form of center, of the universe, of the self, and wrote with remarkable honesty about the theological and scientific crisis that hit him during his lifetime. And for that he was killed, as we all know. Descartes instead chose to do a philosophy and a mathematics in a Machiavellian style, highly interested in the economic, social and political realities of the day. And Cartesianism is by all means the philosophy of the Christian state, and in no way embedded in the crisis of his day and age. How different Descartes was from his predecessor Bruno and from his contemporary Spinoza, who avoided the realities of the day, lived a careful life of the heretic, knowing very well what happened to Bruno, and wrote his Ethics, the book by all means worthy of every day and age. Part 3. What philosophers and artists do. When Freud and Du Bois-Reymond make notice of 3 wounds that philosophers feel, they do not write a philosophy of science, but rather tell us something about what philosophers do, which is exactly that, to feel the wounds that are buried deep inside us, that will never heal, and that continue to crack the world. Philosophers are no doctors, in that their aim is not to heal the wound, of course. Rather, their aim is to find a way to live it. Indeed, to be worthy of the wounds, of the cracks and of the crises that matter in our times. And as we saw a similar sensitivity with Haruki Murakami, it is important to add to this that this is actually a shared force of both philosophy and the arts, which is to find ways to live the wounds that matter to them today. This does not mean that artist and philosopher should search for ways to identify these wounds. Being bothered by them, being constantly reminded of them, being in pain because of these wounds, means that you experiment with a kind of creativity that allows one to map these wounds. The goal is not to write about them, to consider the wounds as entities opposite of you, to give form to them and analyze them as such. On the contrary, there is only the necessity to live the void that they are. Of course, this is a daring maneuver and comes with a saying goodbye to the world of others. It comes with an ethics of invisibility, as it is not the building up of the true, the beautiful and the good that is at stake here, but, to speak with Nietzsche, with a search for a free spirit that is being released then. The free spirit that, contrary to the free mind, always responds with an I would prefer not to, before traveling unforeseen dimensionalities and directionalities. Part 4, Micro-fascisms. What does it mean to do art and to do philosophy today? Of course, this demands a sensitivity for the wounds that we find deep inside ourselves today. Old wounds, no doubt, that for some reason become more and more sensitive again, that are being hurt by the economic, social and political realities that we live. The true artists and the true philosophers are not living an easy life in that respect, as they all too often can hardly bear the misfortunes that crack them open, that threaten them in such an essential way that they just have to write, act and perform in order to resist the pain. In a tragic way, it is not a choice to live a life like this, it is a necessity. To address these wounds in one's writings, in one's artworks, in one's walk of life, one can perhaps be seen as which can perhaps be seen best as an ongoing negotiation, a micropolitics of the crisis at stake, a being occupied with this crisis, this discomfort. So in a post-media age where the algorithms of Facebook give rise to many different forms of narcissism, capturing us in the economical, social and political dreams of the Christian state, the strong leader, the fascist rule, that we see on the rise today, it is too easy for the artist and the philosopher to be an anti-fascist in that sense. We have to be more keen on what our position is. Deleuze and Guattari had already stressed this in their book 1,000 Plateaus. They say you have to see the fascist inside you, the fascist you yourself sustain, nourish and cherish. The fascist that is both personal and collective, that is at work in every part of our daily life, that cuts across the state, neighborhood relations and the pollution of Lake Erie at the same moment. And it didn't stop there, of course. The genealogies of fascist machineries change but do not stop wounding, crying, praying, chanting, singing, evolving in many shapes and forms in reality. Being responsible in this sense does not only mean to stand up for the weak and the powerless. It does not mean to take position. On the contrary, in order to live the wound, one has to escape every present. One has to start living the void, the crack itself. The only way to map the micro-fascisms at work is to live them. In his introduction to Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipe, Michel Foucault praises the authors by saying that the new form of thinking that they delivered was not some sort of flashy Hegel or something like that. It was an introduction to non-fascist life. Beyond philosophy, but also beyond art, Deleuze and Guattari lived the wound of 1968 by exploring its void, the mighty crack that it opened up in French Academy, in Parisian intelligentsia, in the woods of Vincennes, in red wine, in anti-psychiatry, and in thought. And it didn't stop there, of course. Deleuze and Guattari lived their wounds. They managed to do away with the humanisms that made up the economic, social, and political realities of their days, of 68. They acted like Tsukuru at the last stage of the novel that I started this talk with. And this is a quote from Murakami again. He calmed himself, shut his eyes and fell asleep. The rare light of consciousness, like the last express train of the night, began to fade into the distance, gradually speeding up, growing smaller until it was finally sucked into the depths of the night where it disappeared. All that remained was the sound of the wind slipping through a stand of white birch trees. End of quote. Supersensitive, the purely expressed, free from the present, invisible, exactly on the wound where life takes place. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick Dolphijn. Let me see what question to ask. Maybe I'll rephrase the first question I had in my mind as a state, as seeing this as a sort of the plea for the wound is also a plea against thinking of the self in terms of a constant improvement through healing, which is, of course, a specific idea of what our human being or our humanity is, getting better and better and better and improving and making sure we heal every wound that might have inflicted or is inflicted on us through contacts with others, human or non-human. So I first wanted to phrase that as a question, but I now phrase it as a plea or as a statement. So my first question would be another one. You refer to more 19th century thinkers. Well, sorry, not 19th century, but you refer to through Freud to Copernicus. Yeah. I was wondering, do you think that also our idea of humanity has radically or is radically changing now through our different ideas about biology? Our different ideas of how we coexist with bacteria, for instance, or the different ideas of how we coexist with non-human agents. Could you reflect on that or elaborate a bit on that? If I'm understandable what I'm trying to ask.
No, I see where you're getting at. I think what is important here is, and this is what Freud also means, is that these ideas, we can call them post-human ideas, are not new. They do not necessarily happen after the idea of humanism, especially the kind of humanism that was so very popular in the 19th century and which we are still somehow chewing upon. What Freud already said, but what we see in the contemporary writings of people like Gilles Deleuze and Michel and also of the two other speakers, is that this other way of thinking humanity, the human being, has always already been there. It's just getting more and more heard of these days because of the urgencies, because of what you can call them the wounds that somehow become more and more painful, or it becomes more obvious that to put it very simply, that the 19th century ideal of humanism just won't work and has never worked and has always been a kind of a state fable, which has been incredibly influential for political reasons, but which, it just doesn't work. Interesting thing about the whole of 19th century psychoanalysis is that many of these authors, not only Freud, but they have a very strange relationship to people like René Descartes. When we now study philosophy, he's considered to be the saint of modern thinking, as kind of the progress thinking, which started with Descartes. Then we got rid of God, and we could kind of think of ourselves finally. But if you read these 19th century sources, they are very critical about the anthropocentrism that is at work already in Descartes. So they use these terms. For some reason, maybe it was because after the Second World War we just needed to move on and we needed to rebuild the country or whatever. For some reason, Descartes is still extremely influential in how we see the economic, social, and political realities of the day. But obviously it didn't work, and we have to rethink the concept of humanity radically, because the times force us to do that.
That's clear. Is there a question from the audience? Yeah. There is a mic coming your way.
Yes, thank you very much for that beautiful talk. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I would first like to make a link to a talk or to a speaker later on in the day, Jennifer Tuin, who talks about leaky networks and or who has written about that. And somehow your talk about cracks and wounds reminded me of that, especially in terms of your new materialist research. But I have one question for you, and that is if you can relate your talk or your views of the crack and the wound as you describe it, if you can somehow connect that to the lecture of the first speaker. I know I'm challenging you here now, but to the way he was talking about death and philosophy as a way to sort of, how do you say, provoke death or flirt with death, or what was it? Can you connect your talk somehow to his?
I think I can thank you for the question. I think I can connect very well to what David has been writing about over the past few years. We've worked together before. I am reading similar works that he's been reading, although he knows much more about the kind of literature that he's citing. But the question of technology is definitely of crucial importance here. Although my question to David would then be, is technology nowadays so radically different than what happened in the 19th century? Because, of course, this was already noted in another question from the audience, that the sources that you used in this talk were very much about the kind of the 1990s focus on kind of new computer networks and all that. But I think that there are many more examples to give of how writers have been struggling with the idea of the human in relation to technology. I mean, you can read Whitehead, for instance. I mean, it's not a fiction writer, but when Whitehead talks of nature, the whole idea of human and technology is also very interestingly connected to one another and provokes us to think differently about the human being. So this is early 20th century. I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think cheers, thank you. I agree. I mean, I guess you could argue. I mean, I think Jacques Ellul, for example, argued that some kind of transformation took place, you know, during and after the Industrial Revolution, when, in a sense, technology, from being something that's kind of sedimented in culture, becomes almost independent of culture. It can become transmitted from one point on the planet to another much more quickly because communications improve. So now if you kind of write software, you know, you write code in London, it can be transmitted to another part of the planet, and perhaps if you've got a 3D printer, you can even replicate something there that the code, you know, where the code is, you know. So there's been this displacement of technology from place, from topos, from culture, I think. So, you know, you could argue that there has been a sort of a shift, or if you like, a catastrophe, if you want to use those terms, in our relationship to technology. But it obviously precedes the kind of cyberpunk era that I was kind of alluding to, so I completely agree.
Is there a last question from the audience? If not, then I'd like to close off this panel, and we have some time for a lunch now, or get some fresh air. We will come back here at 1:30 for our next panel, and so see you then. Thanks.